My name is Demi Poole, and at 45 years old, as a colonel in the United States Army, I thought I'd seen the face of betrayal on the battlefield. But that night, as they snapped handcuffs on my wrists on the very stage where I was being honored, my father raised his champagne flute and smiled. "I was the one who reported her," he said, his voice loud enough for every camera to capture. The room fell silent. Everyone stared at me as if they'd just watched a hero unmask a villain. But I wasn't shocked that he'd done it. I was shocked that after all these years, I still hoped he'd be different. I was shocked that the look of sheer satisfaction in his eyes as he watched me fall hurt more than the cold steel on my skin. He had no idea. His act of destroying me was the very key that would unlock a far worse truth he'd buried for 30 years. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments, hit that like button, and subscribe if you believe that sometimes the greatest battle isn't with an enemy overseas, but with the people who share your own blood. The ballroom of the Willard Intercontinental Hotel glittered under the weight of its own history. Crystal chandeliers dripped light onto the sea of Army service uniforms, the deep blue fabric a symbol of the order and discipline that had defined my entire adult life. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low, confident murmur of Washington, D.C. military elite. I stood on the brightly lit stage, the starched wool of my own dress uniform feeling like a second skin. A moment before, a 4-star general had pinned the Distinguished Service Medal to my chest. Its weight was a heavy, satisfying presence, the physical embodiment of 25 years of service, of logistics chains built in deserts and anti-corruption networks established in war zones. The flashbulbs from the press corps were like tiny, silent bursts of lightning, freezing the moment in time. I allowed myself a brief, disciplined smile and scanned the crowd. My eyes found their table immediately. Table 12, front and center. And there he was, my father, Harold Poole. He wasn't clapping. While generals and their spouses offered polite, respectful applause, he just sat there, his hands clasped on the table, his knuckles white. He stared up at me with an expression I knew better than my own reflection: judgment. It was a look that could curdle milk, a look that had followed me from childhood report cards to my graduation at West Point. Beside him, my mother looked impossibly small and pale, her hands fluttering in her lap as she nervously pleated the fabric of a silk napkin. A familiar chill, cold and sharp, crawled up my spine. I took a slow, steadying breath, the way I'd trained myself to do before every mission. A chaplain once told me, "In the storm, be the rock, not the leaf." For a lifetime, I had tried to be the rock. I looked away from my father, focusing on the insignia of a fellow officer in the third row. Today is my day, I told myself, a desperate internal command. Don't let him ruin it. It was such a naive thought. The applause faded, and just as the general was about to return to the podium, 2 men in dark, impeccably tailored suits stepped onto the stage from the wings. They weren't military. They moved with the quiet, practiced precision of federal agents. The room stopped breathing. The gentle clinking of silverware and glasses went silent. I heard a single, sharp clink from somewhere in the back as a wine glass slipped from a hand and hit the floor. But the only sound I could truly hear was the drumbeat of my own heart, suddenly loud in my ears. It wasn't frantic. It was slow, steady, the rhythm of a soldier waiting for impact. One of the agents, a heavy-set man with a weary face, stepped up to the microphone. "Colonel Demi Poole," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. And then the second agent spoke, his voice cutting through the gilded air like a razor. "You are under arrest for the crimes of espionage and treason against the United States of America." The words echoed off the ornate walls. Treason, treason, treason. A vile, suffocating sound. I didn't look at the agents. I didn't look at the stunned faces of my colleagues. I looked at my father, and I saw it. Just for a fraction of a second, before he could compose his face into a mask of theatrical grief, I saw a flicker of pure, unadulterated triumph in his eyes, a flash of victory. Then, the performance began. Harold Poole pushed his chair back and stood up. It was a slow, deliberate movement, designed to draw every eye, every camera lens in the room. He waited until the red recording light swiveled toward him. As a soldier, he began, his voice trembling with perfectly rehearsed emotion. I swore an oath to defend this country against all enemies, foreign and domestic. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Then, he turned his gaze directly on me, his daughter, standing there under the hot glare of the stage lights. Sometimes, he declared, his voice rising, the enemy is sleeping in your own house. He turned back to the cameras, his face a portrait of a patriot's agony. He raised his champagne flute, not in celebration of my achievement, but as a toast to my destruction. I was the one who reported her. A stunned silence hung in the air for a beat. Then, a hesitant smattering of applause started from a table near the back. It was followed by another, and then another, a horrific domino effect. Within seconds, the entire ballroom erupted in a thunderous ovation. They were clapping for him, for the patriotic father who had chosen country over his own daughter. They were validating his betrayal, sanctifying it, and in doing so, they cast me out completely. In their eyes, I was no longer a decorated colonel. I was a traitor. The agents moved in. I felt the cold, precise snap of the handcuffs closing around my wrists behind my back. The metal was biting and final. Through it all, I felt my mother's gaze on me. I turned my head, searching for her face one last time. She was crying, her tear-streaked face a mask of misery. But she wasn't looking at me. Her eyes were fixed on my father, her expression a desperate, silent plea, as if begging him to make it all stop. He, the grand conductor of this orchestra of ruin, simply placed a hand on her shoulder in a gesture of paternalistic comfort. And at his touch, she broke. She looked away from him, down at her lap. She chose him. She chose silence. That final act, her quiet surrender, her turning away in my moment of absolute devastation, was a deeper cut than her husband's public declaration. His betrayal was loud and theatrical. Hers was a quiet, suffocating poison. As the agents led me off the stage, past the tables of my former peers who now refused to meet my eye, I was no longer an officer being honored. I was just a daughter, abandoned by both the man who gave me life and the woman who taught me how to endure him. That turning away, it wasn't a new wound. It was just the final twist of a blade that had been there for 30 years. That look of triumph in my father's eyes on stage. It wasn't new. It was just the final exhibit in a museum of grievances he'd been curating my entire life. The betrayal at the Willard Hotel wasn't a sudden storm. It was the final erosion of a dam that had been cracking for decades. As I sat in the silent, sterile processing room, the memories flooded in, each one a perfectly preserved artifact of the man who had just destroyed me. It started small, as these things always do. I was 12, and the world still felt like a place where hard work paid off in simple, satisfying ways. I'd spent a whole summer practicing at the Charleston Rifle Club, my small hands learning the steady discipline of breath and trigger pull. I won the state youth marksmanship competition. I remember running the 6 blocks home, my lungs burning, the heavy gold-plated trophy clutched to my chest like the most precious object in the world. My heart was hammering, not from the run, but from a desperate, childish need for his approval. I burst through the screen door into our small house, shouting, "Dad, I won! I won!" He was sitting in his armchair, reading the Post and Courier. He slowly lowered the paper and looked at the trophy. He took it from my hands, his fingers brushing against mine without warmth. He turned it over, inspecting it with the critical eye of a quartermaster checking inventory. He didn't smile. He just grunted. "Good," he said, his voice flat. He walked over to the fireplace and placed the trophy dead center on the mantelpiece. Finally, something came from all my training. That was it. Not, "I'm so proud of you, Demi." Not even a pat on the back. Just a quiet claim of ownership. Later, when his army buddies came over for poker, I'd hear him from the kitchen, his voice booming with false pride. He'd point to the mantel. "Yeah, the kid's got a good eye, but it's all in the coaching. I trained her myself." He had taken my victory, my hard work, and turned it into an ornament for his own ego. It was no longer my achievement. It was his. 4 years later, the acceptance letter from West Point arrived. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope that felt like the key to a different life. My mother cried when I opened it, real tears of joy that streamed down her face as she hugged me tight. "Oh, Demi, my brilliant girl," she whispered. It was a rare, beautiful moment of pure celebration. Then my father came in from the garage, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. He took the letter from me, his eyes scanning the formal text. His face hardened. He didn't throw it, but he let it drop onto the kitchen table with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "So," he said, his voice laced with a familiar, bitter contempt. "You're going to join the same pack of arrogant, desk-riding officers who ruined my career." He looked at me, his eyes cold. "They'll brainwash you, turn you into one of their little robots. You'll forget where you came from." Instead of a congratulations, he planted a seed of guilt. In his world, my dream wasn't a triumph. It was a betrayal of his personal failure. My success was a personal insult to his own stalled life, a life he blamed on everyone but himself. And then there were the Sunday dinners. In the South, Sunday dinner is supposed to be sacred, a time for family, for fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and sweet tea. At our house, it was a weekly tribunal where I was always the one on trial. My father would sit at the head of the table, a can of Pabst Blue Ribbon sweating in his hand, and the sermon would begin. "Your brother Matt, now he's smart," he'd say, gesturing with his can towards my older brother, who worked a dead-end accounting job in North Charleston. "He knows how to make easy money, works with his head, not his back." Then his eyes would swivel to me in my ROTC uniform from a weekend drill. "And then there's you. Chose the hard life, rolling around in the mud for pennies. For what? So some fat general in an air-conditioned office can tell you where to go? What a waste." My mother would just sit there, her expression carefully neutral, silently passing the bowl of green beans. Her silence was its own language. It was a form of complicity, a quiet agreement that my father's cruelty was just a fact of life, like the humid Charleston summers. Her silence taught me that my pain wasn't worth a disruption, that keeping the fragile piece of our Southern family image was more important than defending her own daughter. As I climbed the ranks, his narrative simply adapted. The story he told the world, and himself, was that my success had made me arrogant, that I had forgotten him. I remember one night I'd come home for a rare weekend visit. I was a major then. I overheard him on the phone with my uncle. "She's gotten real proud," he said, his voice dripping with self-pity. "Thinks because she's a major, she can look down on her old man, never calls, never checks in." The lie was so blatant, it stole my breath. I called every single week, a scheduled duty I never missed, and every call was the same. He'd answer with a monosyllable, complain about his back, or launch into a tirade about how the country was going to hell. He'd critique every decision I'd ever made. He didn't want my concern. He didn't want a relationship. He wanted a story. A story where he was the forgotten victim and I was the ungrateful, heartless child. And he spent his life telling that story to anyone who would listen. Maya Angelou's words echoed in my head, a quote I'd read years ago. "When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time." He had been showing me who he was for 30 years, at the marksmanship competition, at the kitchen table, on the phone with my uncle. And finally, on that stage in Washington, D.C., he was a man hollowed out by bitterness, so desperate for a moment of significance that he would burn down his own daughter's life just to feel the warmth of the flames. If you've ever had a family member who twisted your success into something ugly or made you feel guilty for your own happiness, support this story by hitting the like button, and in the comments, just type the words, "I see you." Sometimes just being seen is all we need. Looking back at that gallery of memories, at all those stolen trophies and poisoned congratulations, the question that burned in my mind wasn't why he did it. The question was, what was I enduring all of this for? The answer to the question, what was I enduring all of this for, was 4 gray concrete walls. My new world at Fort Meade, Maryland, was a box. No windows, no clocks, no sky, just a poured concrete floor, a steel slab bed bolted to the wall, and a stainless steel toilet that gleamed coldly under the 24-hour hum of a fluorescent light. The silence was the worst part. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket, only occasionally punctured by the rhythmic tread of a guard's boots echoing down the empty corridor. Time ceased to have meaning. It was measured only in the metallic clank of a food slot opening and closing 3 times a day. They took my uniform. The Army service uniform, with its crisp lines and polished brass, was more than clothing. It was my identity, earned over 2 decades of sweat, sacrifice, and dedication. They sealed it in a plastic bag and handed me a bright orange jumpsuit. The fabric was coarse and smelled of industrial bleach. Dressed in the color of disgrace, I was no longer Colonel Poole. I was an inmate, an asset to be interrogated, a problem to be contained. Every morning, a guard would slide a copy of the Washington Post through the slot. It wasn't an act of kindness, it was part of the psychological warfare. And every morning, my father's face was on the front page. Harold Poole, the American hero. Harold Poole, the stoic symbol of uncompromising patriotism. The articles painted him as a modern-day Brutus, a man who loved his country so much he would sacrifice his own child for it. They wanted me to break. They wanted me to sit in this gray box surrounded by the world's applause for my destroyer and start to believe the lie myself. At West Point, they teach you to improvise, adapt, overcome. I realized this was just another battlefield, one fought not with bullets, but with silence and isolation. The interrogation room was another windowless box, this one furnished with a metal table and 3 chairs. My interrogators were 2 CID agents, a man and a woman. The man was doughy, with a cheap suit and the tired eyes of a career bureaucrat. The woman was sharp and angular, with eyes that assessed me not as a person, but as a puzzle to be solved. The ultimate humiliation was in how they addressed me. Not Colonel, not even ma'am, just Poole. After years of commanding thousands of soldiers, of being briefed by generals, I was now being questioned by a captain and a chief warrant officer who spoke to me as if I were a piece of faulty equipment. "Your father has been very cooperative, Poole," the man said, sliding a thin file across the cold metal table. His voice had a wheezing quality. "He told us you often complained about the bureaucratic machine, that you had sensitive contacts overseas." He was twisting my professional frustrations, the very drive that made me effective at cutting through red tape, into a motive for treason. I remained silent, my hands resting calmly in my lap. I would not give them the satisfaction of a reaction. Then the woman delivered the finishing blow. She slid a single sheet of paper from the file. It was a sworn affidavit. The statement was concise, clinical, and utterly false. It claimed that on a specific date, Harold Poole had witnessed me copying classified documents onto a personal hard drive in my home office, and at the bottom of the page was his signature. I recognized the familiar spiky scrawl, the way his H was always too large, the P. A sharp, aggressive downstroke. His signature, once a source of childhood comfort on a permission slip, was now a weapon plunged directly into my heart. But the deepest agony didn't come from my father's lies. I'd spent a lifetime in that museum of grievances. I knew its curator well. The true betrayal came from the system I had sworn an oath to protect. My entire career had been built on integrity. Yet, at the first sign of trouble, the institution folded. Not a single one of the senior officers who had praised my work at the AUSA Gala just days before had reached out. No calls from my supposed friends at the Pentagon. They were afraid. Afraid the stain of my alleged treason would splash onto them. I had become a contagion, a career-ending disease to be avoided at all costs. It was a bitter lesson in the transactional nature of loyalty. In the military, you're part of a brotherhood until you're not. When you become a problem, you are jettisoned with cold, operational efficiency. I was well and truly alone. One night, after a 10-hour interrogation session that had left me physically and emotionally drained, I was escorted back to my cell. I collapsed onto the steel bed, the exhaustion so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing me down. Despair, a cold and creeping fog, began to settle in. I stared at a crack in the concrete wall, tracing its path with my eyes, trying to focus on anything other than the suffocating emptiness. Then I heard it, a soft, electronic chime. It was barely audible, but in the tomb-like silence of the cell, it sounded like a gunshot. The secure tablet they'd given me to communicate with my military-appointed lawyer, a device I knew was monitored, every keystroke logged, flickered to life. A notification had appeared, but it wasn't from my lawyer. It was a push alert from an encrypted peer-to-peer messaging app I'd installed on the device myself, a backdoor that I knew CID's standard monitoring software wouldn't catch. My heart hammered against my ribs. I picked up the tablet. The message was 3 simple words. They're wrong. And underneath, 2 initials. E.g., Ethan Graves. Warrant Officer Graves. My unit's best cybersecurity specialist. A skinny, quiet kid from rural Oregon who I had once gone to bat for, shielding him from a bull-headed major who wanted to bury him in paperwork for a minor infraction. He was a good soldier. A loyal soldier. I stared at those 3 words on the screen. They're wrong. It wasn't an exoneration. It wasn't a key to get me out of this cell. But it was something. It was a signal flare in the crushing darkness. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the emotion that washed over me wasn't despair. It was hope. After 3 weeks in the vault of silence, I was released on bail. My freedom constrained to the 4 walls of my small Alexandria apartment by a GPS ankle monitor. The concrete box had been replaced by a gilded cage. I was no longer a prisoner of the state, but a prisoner of the narrative. And the warden of that narrative was my father. He was everywhere. His face, etched with a carefully crafted sorrow, stared back at me from every cable news channel. He became the darling of the conservative talk show circuit. I watched, my stomach churning, as he sat on a plush leather sofa on a set bathed in patriotic red, white, and blue. The host, a man famous for his manufactured outrage, leaned in with a sympathetic air. "It must have been an agonizing decision, Harold," the host said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. My father nodded slowly, dabbing a dry eye with his knuckle. "It was the hardest thing I've ever had to do," he said, his voice catching perfectly. "I taught that girl about honor, about duty. And when she lost her way, it was my duty to bring her back, no matter how painful." Then he weaponized my childhood. He recounted a memory of a fishing trip we took on Lake Moultrie when I was 10. It had been a rare good day, a moment of peaceful connection I had held onto for years. He twisted it, reframing it into a parable about national loyalty. I told her that day, he lied to an audience of millions, that just like you never turn your back on your fishing buddy, you never, ever turn your back on your country. A disgraced supply sergeant, dishonorably discharged for fraud, was lecturing the nation on honor. The irony was so thick I felt like I was choking on it. A wave of nausea washed over me, and I clicked the TV off, the silence of my apartment suddenly roaring in my ears. That night, a ghost appeared at my door. Ethan Graves slipped into my apartment after dark, carrying a heavy backpack and moving with the silent efficiency of a man who lives in the digital shadows. "They cut the surveillance feeds to your hallway for 60 seconds, Colonel," he said, not as a greeting, but as an immediate assurance. "We're clean." He set to work, pulling laptops and encrypted drives from his bag. Within minutes, he had established a secure, untraceable communications network inside my own home. He was my chosen family, the one forged in loyalty, not blood. "Ma'am, they're not just framing you," he said, his eyes fixed on his screen while he gestured toward the blank TV. "They're building a myth. They need to turn Harold Poole into a saint to give his testimony weight. The PR firm running this media campaign, Veritas Communications, is a direct subsidiary of Atlantic Forge." He slid a black external hard drive across my coffee table. "This is everything I could pull from the dark. Encrypted data shows an unauthorized server accessed your personal military accounts 3 weeks before your arrest. The server's IP address pings to a location in Charleston, South Carolina, half a mile from your father's house." I stared at the small black rectangle. It was the first solid thing I'd had to hold on to in a month. It was more than data. It was a weapon. "Thank you, Ethan," I said, my voice quiet. He just nodded. General Patton said, Accept the challenges so that you can feel the exhilaration of victory. We'll get there, Colonel. The next afternoon, my mother came to visit. She carried a large pot of chicken noodle soup, a traditional offering of Southern comfort, as if broth and noodles could somehow mend a life that had been shattered. She sat stiffly on my sofa, avoiding my gaze, the silence stretching between us until it was thin and brittle. Your father, she finally began, her voice a reedy whisper. He's not the man I married anymore, Demi. The bitterness, it's eaten him alive. She explained how men from Atlantic Forge had approached him. They didn't offer him just money. They offered him something far more seductive. Redemption. A chance to rewrite his own history of failure. They told him they would restore his honor, she said, her eyes welling with tears. They told him you were part of the swamp in Washington that needed to be drained, and he believed them. It was easier for him to believe you were a traitor than to admit he's been a fraud his whole life. She started to sob then, quiet, helpless little sounds. He would rather see you in prison, Demi, than admit that he failed. She brought no help, no solutions, just a painful confirmation of the bottomless depth of my father's delusion. She was a messenger from a world I no longer belonged to, a world where keeping up appearances was more important than the truth. As she was about to leave, fumbling with her purse at the door, she pressed a small folded piece of paper into my hand, her fingers trembling. This is the name of the bank, she whispered, her eyes darting around as if expecting to be caught. He received a large deposit. It was the final piece, the straw that didn't break the camel's back, but rather reinforced its spine. Her one small act of defiance. After she left, I stared at the name of the Charleston Community Bank on the slip of paper. I picked up the secure phone Ethan had left me. They've made my father a media star, Ethan, I said, my voice cold and steady. They think they control the story. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Ethan's voice came back, clear and resolute. Then we go to where the story began, Colonel, he said. Charleston. We're going to tear their whole damn play down on its opening night. A plan began to form, sharp and clear in my mind. The counterattack was no longer a vague hope. It now had a name, it had a location, and it had a target. Returning to Charleston felt like stepping into a ghost story where I was the main character. The humid air, thick with the sweet scent of magnolias and salt marsh, was the same air I'd breathed as a child. The cobblestone streets and pastel-colored antebellum houses were beautiful, a perfect postcard of Southern charm. But beneath that genteel surface, I knew a dirty conspiracy was festering, and my own family was at its heart. My lawyer had convinced the judge to modify my bail, allowing me to travel under the guise of caring for an ailing mother. It was a perfect cover. Ethan had arrived 2 days before me, establishing our base of operations in a place no one would ever look for a colonel. A cheap, run-down motel off I-26, the kind with flickering neon signs and peeling paint. The room smelled of stale cigarette smoke and industrial cleaner. Taped to the drab, water-stained wall was a complex diagram Ethan had created, a spiderweb of names, shell corporations, and wire transfers connecting Harold Poole to Atlantic Forge. In the center of it all was my name. Welcome to the battlefield, Colonel, Ethan said, handing me a paper box. Inside was fried chicken and a biscuit from a nearby Bojangles. The plan is simple. You use your local knowledge, the human intel. I'll handle the digital forensics. We need irrefutable proof of the money trail. Sitting on the edge of a lumpy mattress, eating greasy fried chicken under the buzz of a fluorescent light, I felt less like a daughter returning home and more like a deep-cover operative infiltrating enemy territory. General Grant's words came to mind. I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer. My summer of war had just begun. The next morning, armed with the scrap of paper my mother had given me, I walked into the Charleston Community Bank. It was the same bank where I'd opened my first savings account, depositing birthday money from my grandmother. The polished marble floors and hushed, air-conditioned quiet felt strange, like a memory viewed through distorted glass. Behind the teller counter was Mrs. Gable, a kind grandmotherly woman with perfectly coiffed silver hair who had known me since I was a girl in pigtails. Her warm smile faltered when she saw me, replaced by a look of pity and confusion. "Demi, dear," she said quietly, I saw the news." "I know, Mrs. Gable," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "I need your help." In the privacy of her small glass-walled office, her professionalism kicked in. She hesitated when I asked to see my father's recent statements, citing privacy regulations. I didn't argue. I just leaned forward and looked her straight in the eye. "Mrs. Gable, you've known my father your whole life, and you've known me. Who do you think is telling the truth here?" She held my gaze for a long moment, her expression softening. With a heavy sigh, she turned to her computer, her fingers clicking on the keyboard. She printed a single page and pushed it across the desk. My eyes scanned the columns of figures until I found it. A wire transfer for $30,000 deposited 2 days before my arrest, from a company called AF Systems LLC. "He told me it was an advance," Mrs. Gable said, her voice barely a whisper, filled with doubt. "For a documentary being made about his life in the service." I folded the paper and put it in my purse. "Thank you, Mrs. Gable. You've done the right thing." As soon as I was back in my rental car, I texted Ethan, "AF Systems, LLC." Less than 5 minutes later, he replied, "Confirmed. Shell Corporation, wholly owned subsidiary of Atlantic Forge." That evening, I went to my childhood home. The house felt smaller, haunted by the ghosts of what it was supposed to be. My mother didn't greet me with questions or accusations. She just led me to my old bedroom, her movements furtive and silent. She pulled an old shoebox from the back of the closet and handed it to me. Inside was a meticulously organized collection of my father's financial documents, bank statements, credit card bills, loan applications, that she had been secretly gathering for weeks. "He's become a different person, Demi," she said, her eyes filling with tears. "He talks all the time about his legacy, about getting the recognition he deserves. They gave him what you in the Army never could, a feeling of importance." I sifted through the papers, the smell of dust and old cardboard filling the air. And then I found it. Tucked between a car insurance policy and a tax return was a contract. A formal agreement between Harold Poole and Veritas Communications, the PR firm owned by Atlantic Forge. It wasn't a contract for a documentary. It was a consulting agreement, outlining a payment schedule in exchange for his full cooperation in the internal investigation and public relations campaign concerning Colonel Demi Poole. He wasn't a victim. He wasn't a pawn. He was a paid contractor. The truth was colder and uglier than I had ever imagined. News of my presence in Charleston traveled fast. The next night, after a tense dinner with my mother, I was walking back to my car in the parking lot of a local seafood restaurant. A figure stepped out from behind a large pickup truck, blocking my path. It was the smug-faced journalist from Fox News, the one who had interviewed my father. "Colonel Poole," he said, a slick, predatory smile on his face. He was shorter in person. "I think we can help each other out. My employers are prepared to arrange for the charges against you to be quietly dropped. All you have to do is sign a non-disclosure agreement, maybe take a long vacation out of the country for a while." It was a threat wrapped in the language of a business deal. "Get out, or we will crush you." I let a small, cold smile touch my lips. I remembered the tiny recording device, disguised as a button on my blazer, that Ethan had insisted I wear. "Tell your boss I'm not interested in a clean record," I said, my voice steady. "I'm interested in the truth." I turned and walked away, not looking back, my heart pounding a steady, defiant rhythm. I could feel his eyes on my back. He thought he was setting a trap for me. He had no idea he had just walked into mine. The annual Charleston Magnolia Festival was the picture of Southern propriety. Held in White Point Garden, the air was a sweet perfume of blooming flowers and salty sea breeze from the harbor. The entire town, it seemed, was there. Families spread out on picnic blankets, women in bright floral dresses fanning themselves in the shade of ancient oak trees. It was a celebration of community, tradition, and above all, appearances. It was the perfect stage for my father's next performance. Ethan and I stood at the edge of the crowd, half hidden by a statue of a forgotten Confederate general. We watched as Harold Poole was introduced as Charleston's Patriot Citizen of the Year. He walked onto the gazebo stage not in his old, ill-fitting uniform, but in a tailored navy blue suit that I knew had been paid for by Atlantic Forge. He looked polished, important. He looked like a lie. He started his speech with a predictable ode to family values and tradition, his voice resonating with practiced sincerity. The crowd nodded along, captivated. Then he expertly pivoted the narrative to his favorite subject, his own heroic suffering. Recently, he began, his voice dropping into a dramatic hush. My family has endured a great trial. He paused, letting the crowd lean in. My daughter, a woman I love with all my heart, has lost her way. I felt my jaw clench. Ethan shot me a concerned glance, but I just shook my head, my eyes fixed on the man on the stage. She was influenced by the corrupt ideologies in Washington, he continued, his voice rising with righteous indignation. She forgot the values her mother and I worked so hard to instill in her. He scanned the crowd, his face a mask of profound sorrow, and then he delivered the kill shot. And my poor wife, he said, his voice cracking. My loving, devoted wife. In her boundless love for our daughter, her mind has been poisoned. She's been manipulated. She has even been convinced to help hide her daughter's misguided actions. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Murmurs broke out. I could feel dozens of eyes turning in my direction, people in the crowd recognizing me. Their looks weren't just curious anymore, they were a mixture of pity and contempt. He hadn't just made me a traitor to my country. He had painted my mother as a weak, foolish old woman, a pawn manipulated by her own monstrous child. He had taken her one small act of courage, giving me the bank name, the shoebox, and twisted it into a symptom of her senility and my evil. Something inside me snapped, a cold, clean break. The blood in my veins felt like it was boiling, a searing heat that rose from my chest into my throat. This was no longer about me, my career, my reputation. I could endure the attacks on those. But this was an attack on my mother, the woman who had suffered his tyranny in silence for 40 years. The woman who, in her own quiet, terrified way, had tried to help me. He was punishing her for it, publicly, turning her into a pathetic footnote in his grand story of patriotic martyrdom. I looked at Ethan, my vision narrowing. That's it, I said, my voice low and shaking with a rage so pure it felt like a physical force. I'm done. I couldn't stand there for one more second and listen to him desecrate her name. I turned on my heel and began walking, pushing my way through the stunned crowd. The polite Southern deference parted before me. I could hear his voice droning on, but it was just white noise now. The anger inside me was no longer a simmering coal. It was a volcanic eruption. Every ounce of doubt, every shred of residual daughterly obligation I might have felt for that man was incinerated in that moment. He hadn't just crossed a line. He had vaporized it. I reached my car, wrenched the door open, and slammed it shut behind me. The sound echoed in the quiet parking lot. I fumbled for my secure phone, my hands trembling not with fear, but with adrenaline. I didn't call my father. He was irrelevant now. I scrolled through my contacts to a number I'd been given in the parking lot just the night before, the direct line for the lead counsel of Atlantic Forge. A crisp, corporate voice answered. Mr. Davies's office. Put him on, I said. May I ask who's calling? Tell him it's Colonel Demi Poole. There was a brief pause, then a click. Poole? The lawyer's voice was smooth, arrogant. Changed your mind about our generous offer? I have a message for your boss, I said, my voice as cold and hard as granite. Your offer has expired. I'm not negotiating. I am going to destroy you. I hung up before he could respond. My fingers flew across the screen to another number, one I hadn't dialed in years. An encrypted line I'd kept for emergencies, a direct connection to the office of an old friend, a man I had served with in Afghanistan who was now a 4-star general at the Pentagon. His aide answered. This is Colonel Demi Poole. I need to speak with General Miller. It's a matter of urgent operational security. The words were a calculated risk, a code between soldiers. A few seconds later, his familiar, gravelly voice came on the line. Damie? What's going on? General, I said, my voice clear and unwavering. I need your help. It's time to end this play. The battle had officially begun. There's a moment when silence is no longer an option. If you believe in the power of finally standing up and speaking your truth, hit that like button to support this fight. And in the comments, just type the words, "No more silence." Let's create a chorus they can't ignore. My call to the Pentagon was a lit match tossed into a room full of gasoline. The results came 12 hours later, not with a loud explosion, but with the quiet, authoritative buzz of the secure phone at 0600 sharp. It was General Miller. His voice was all business, the familiar, gravelly tone of a man who'd spent his life making decisions that carried immense weight. There was no preamble, no small talk. Demi, he started, I always knew you were clean. My hands were tied by procedure. You know how it is up here. You've just given me a reason to cut the damn knot. He laid it out with military precision. For the past 18 months, a multi-agency task force had been running a quiet investigation into Atlantic Forge, suspecting them of corporate espionage and bribing government officials. But the company was a fortress, firewalled by lawyers and political connections. The task force was stalled, lacking a critical piece of the puzzle. An asset on the inside, someone who could give them a first-hand look at the company's methods. Unintentionally, Colonel, you became their bait, Miller explained, his voice grim. They used you to create a smokescreen, a media circus to distract from their real operations. Now, you're going to be the hunter. You have my full but covert operational support. I'm giving you the green light. Tell me what you need. For the first time since the cold steel of the handcuffs had closed around my wrists, I felt the ground beneath my feet again. The suffocating isolation began to recede. I wasn't a disgraced officer fighting a lonely battle anymore. I had the full, quiet backing of the United States Army. The dynamic of our mission shifted entirely. Ethan and I turned our dingy motel room into a functional tactical operations center. The diagram he'd taped to the wall became our mission board, the spiderweb of deceit, our battlefield map. I stood before it, studying the lines connecting my father to Atlantic Forge, a bitterness rising in my throat. At West Point, they drilled Sun Tzu's The Art of War into us. Know your enemy and know yourself, and you will not be imperiled in 100 battles. I knew their weaknesses intimately. Atlantic Forge's was a bottomless, predictable greed. My father's was a fragile, all-consuming pride. We would exploit both. We need more than digital evidence, Ethan, I said, pacing the small, threadbare patch of carpet between the beds. The bank statements, the contract, that's for a courtroom. First, we have to win the war of perception. We need a show of force, something undeniable, something that will make the truth a physical presence in the room. Ethan nodded, his expression serious, his fingers never stopping their fluid dance across his keyboard. Hard power projection. I get it. I know some guys, he said simply. He opened a secure video link on his laptop, the connection bouncing through half a dozen servers before it stabilized. On the screen, the face of a hardened, no-nonsense command sergeant major appeared. His name was Marcus Thorne, and he looked like he was carved from granite. He was the team leader for a platoon in the 75th Ranger Regiment, the Army's elite light infantry. I had worked with his men on a particularly nasty deployment in Afghanistan's Kunar province. I remembered them well. Fearless, professional, and fiercely, unshakably loyal to those they trusted. I laid out the plan for him, the objective, the timing, the specific display of disciplined, non-aggressive presence required. It was an unorthodox request, asking active duty Rangers to participate in what was essentially a civilian operation. I didn't know what he would say. Officially, in the eyes of the world, I was still a traitor. He listened intently, his gaze unwavering, his expression unreadable. When I finished, a silence hung in the air. He didn't ask a single question about the charges against me. He didn't ask for authorization codes. He didn't hesitate for a second. Colonel, Sergeant Major Thorne said, his voice a low, steady rumble that carried absolute conviction. "You just give us the time and place. We'll be there." That simple, unconditional statement of trust, from a soldier I hadn't seen in 5 years, hit me harder than any accusation ever could. This was the brotherhood I'd signed up for. This was my real family. A lump formed in my throat, not from anger or despair, but from overwhelming gratitude. 24 hours later, General Miller delivered our ultimate weapon, our legal Excalibur. He sent a secured file to Ethan's laptop. "Read this," he ordered over the phone. The document was a retroactive presidential memorandum, classified top secret. It officially assigned me, Colonel Demi Poole, to a classified counterintelligence investigation, codenamed Operation Evergreen. The target, Atlantic Forge. My arrest, the media campaign, the entire public crucifixion, it was all being officially and legally reframed. "Legally speaking, Demi," Miller explained, a note of grim satisfaction in his voice. "As of this moment, you were never a framed victim. You were a deep-cover operative executing a sanctioned counterintelligence mission. Every charge against you is now null and void. Anyone who knowingly aided the false narrative against you is now guilty of obstruction of justice." It wasn't just a legal shield, it was a sharpened sword. It transformed my status from the accused into the accuser, the hunted into the hunter. All our collected evidence wasn't just for my defense anymore, it was now ammunition for the prosecution of my enemies. And then, as if orchestrated by fate, the perfect opportunity presented itself. My mother called, her voice trembling with confusion. An invitation had arrived at the house, delivered by courier. Thick, cream-colored cardstock with an embossed gold eagle. The Charleston chapter of the Association of the United States Army was hosting a Special Veterans Honors Gala. The guest of honor, slated to receive the Voice of Duty Award for his moral courage, was my father, Harold Poole. The location was the final, arrogant twist of the knife, the grand ballroom of the Charleston Place Hotel. The very same venue where my life had been publicly detonated nearly a year before. Ethan looked at the digital copy of the invitation on his screen, his expression grim. "They're recreating the scene of the crime to humiliate you one last time, Colonel. To put the final nail in the coffin." I looked at the invitation, at my father's name printed in elegant script. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. It wasn't a smile of warmth. It was the smile of a predator that has just seen its prey walk willingly into a perfectly laid trap. "No, Ethan," I said, my voice quiet and certain. "They're not. They're setting the stage for their own curtain call." I looked up at our mission board, at the interconnected lines of their conspiracy. "Get the team ready. We're going to war." The ballroom was exactly as I remembered it, a perfect glittering replica of my personal hell. The same crystal chandeliers cast the same soft, forgiving light. The same gold-embossed AUSA logos adorned the walls. It was a stage reset for the second act of a tragedy, and my father was playing the lead. He walked to the podium, soaking in the applause. He was wearing the same navy suit, his face beaming with the self-satisfaction of a man who believed he was the hero of his own story. He gripped the microphone, cleared his throat, and began his well-rehearsed speech. "Duty," he said, his voice resonating with false humility, "is a lonely road." The audience listened, rapt with admiration for the patriot before them. I stood at the back of the room, concealed in the deep shadows near the service entrance. I was in my full Army service uniform, the deep blue fabric immaculate, the brass polished to a mirror shine. It felt different this time. Not a costume for my own execution, but armor for the coming battle. Ethan stood beside me, a sleek black briefcase held firmly in his hand. "It's almost time, Colonel," he whispered. My heart was pounding, a hard, steady rhythm against my ribs. It wasn't the beat of fear, it was the beat of anticipation. The final countdown. My father was reaching the crescendo of his speech, his voice thick with emotion as he spoke of difficult choices and moral courage. And at that precise moment, the grand double doors at the entrance to the ballroom swung open. It wasn't federal agents this time. It was a 6-man fire team of the 75th Ranger Regiment. They were in their full combat uniforms, the digital camouflage pattern a stark, gritty contrast to the black tie finery of the gala. They moved in perfect synchronized silence, their boots making no sound on the thick carpet. They didn't shout, they didn't run. But their disciplined, lethal presence sucked all the air out of the room. A wave of silence rolled from the back of the ballroom to the front as every head turned to watch them. They moved in a wedge formation, parting the stunned crowd as they marched directly towards the stage. Leading them was Warrant Officer Ethan Graves. My father faltered, his words dying on his lips. He turned, and his expression of smug satisfaction curdled into confusion, then into a flicker of panic. The Rangers fanned out, forming a silent, unbreachable cordon at the back of the stage, their faces impassive, their posture radiating absolute control. Ethan walked calmly to the podium. He didn't shove my father aside, but with a polite yet firm gesture, he effectively displaced him, taking control of the stage. "Excuse the interruption, ladies and gentlemen," Ethan said, his voice amplified by the microphone, clear and ringing with authority. "I have a formal announcement from the Department of the Army." He opened the briefcase and produced a single, sealed manila folder. "By order of the President of the United States, all charges against Colonel Demi Poole are hereby dropped and expunged," he declared. A shocked murmur went through the audience. Ethan raised his voice slightly, cutting through the noise. "Her actions over the past year were part of a sanctioned counterintelligence mission, Operation Evergreen, to investigate the illegal activities of the defense contractor Atlantic Forge." A collective gasp swept the room. My father staggered back a step, his face draining of all color. He looked utterly bewildered, a man whose script had just been set on fire. But the show wasn't over. Ethan gave a subtle signal to a technician at the back of the room. The two enormous projection screens on either side of the stage, which had been displaying the event's logo, suddenly flickered to life. The first thing to appear was an audio waveform. Then the sound of my voice filled the ballroom, crisp and clear from the button microphone I had worn. "Tell your boss I'm not interested in a clean record. I'm interested in the truth." The smug, threatening voice of the Atlantic Forge lawyer followed, his offer of a backroom deal echoing for all to hear. The image on the screens changed. It was a high-resolution photograph of the Charleston Community Bank statement, the $30,000 wire transfer from the Shell Corporation AF Systems circled in red. The image changed again. This time, it was the contract my mother had found. The agreement between Harold Poole and the PR firm, his signature clearly visible, outlining his role as a paid contractor in their smear campaign. Gasps of disbelief and outrage erupted from the crowd. Then came the final, irrefutable proof. Ethan had hacked the security footage from the parking garage of a downtown office building. The video was grainy, but the subjects were unmistakable. The screens showed my father, Harold Poole, shaking hands with a man from Atlantic Forge and accepting a thick, heavy briefcase. The same briefcase the man then placed in the trunk of his car. The video ended. The room was plunged into an abyss of absolute silence. Every eye in that ballroom was now on my father. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a patriot. He was just a cheap sellout. He seemed to shrink before our eyes, slumping into the chair behind the podium, no longer a man on a stage, but a rat in a trap. He looked small, pathetic. As the house lights came up, I stepped out of the shadows. I walked the long aisle through the silent, staring crowd, my shoes clicking with a steady, resolute rhythm on the polished floor. I walked up the steps and onto the stage, stopping directly in front of him. I looked down at the broken man in the chair. In his eyes, I saw no remorse, only the blank, terrified confusion of a narcissist whose audience had finally walked out on him. Proverbs 26:27 whispered in the back of my mind. Whoever digs a pit will fall into it. If someone rolls a stone, it will roll back on them. His stone had just rolled back and crushed him. The game was over. Victory doesn't feel the way you think it will. There is no soaring music, no slow-motion celebration. There is only the ringing silence after the final shot has been fired. The night of the gala, after the chaos had subsided and federal agents had quietly taken Atlantic Forge executives into custody, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt hollowed out, utterly exhausted. The entire city of Charleston was buzzing with the scandal of the Poole family, but I couldn't stay in the sterile quiet of my hotel room. I got in my rental car and just drove, my hands steady on the wheel, my mind strangely calm. I found myself pulling into the parking lot at Waterfront Park, the same place I used to ride my bike as a kid to escape the suffocating anger in my house. The salt air was cool and clean, a gentle breeze rustling the palmetto trees. I saw him sitting on one of the park benches overlooking the dark, shimmering water of the harbor. He was just a silhouette against the distant lights of the Ravenel Bridge. As I got closer, I saw that he looked a decade older than he had just 24 hours before. The expensive navy suit, which had made him look so powerful on stage, now looked like a costume on a broken mannequin. It hung loosely on his shrunken frame. I sat down on the other end of the bench, leaving a deliberate space between us, a boundary. We sat in silence for what felt like a long time, the only sounds the gentle lapping of water against the seawall and the distant clang of a buoy. There was nothing left to fight about. The war was over. All that remained were the casualties. "They told me you dishonored the uniform," he finally said, his voice a dry, hoarse rasp. He didn't look at me, just stared out at the black water. "They said I was the only one who could stop you." I didn't say anything. I just listened, giving him the space to unravel the narrative he had clung to for so long. "I wanted to believe it," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "It made me feel important again. Like I was back in the service, like the old days." "What old days, Dad?" I asked, my voice gentle. He finally turned his head, but his eyes were unfocused, looking at a past only he could see. Before they kicked me out. Before everything." For the first time in my entire life, I didn't hear the familiar tones of arrogance or blame in his voice. There was no finger-pointing, no self-pitying tirade. There was only a vast empty space where a man's pride used to be. I remembered a phrase I'd heard in an Al-Anon meeting I'd attended with a friend years ago, a mantra for dealing with the destructive behavior of others. You can't control it, you didn't cause it, and you can't cure it. For years, I had secretly believed that if I were just successful enough, just perfect enough, I could somehow cure his bitterness. Now I saw the truth. His sickness was his own. "I just wanted to be right," he confessed, the words so quiet I almost missed them. Just for once. And that was the most honest thing I had ever heard him say. It was a confession of a lifetime spent feeling wrong, feeling like a failure. A tear escaped my eye and slid down my cheek. It wasn't a tear of pity. It was a tear for the tragedy of it all. The tragedy of a man who had spent his entire life running from himself, only to end up right here, alone on a park bench in the dark. "Being right doesn't always mean being good, Dad," I replied softly. "And I don't need an apology from you. An apology wouldn't mean anything now." I took a deep, steadying breath, the salt air filling my lungs. "I just need you to stop. Stop using me to measure your own worth. Stop making my life a character in your play." He finally turned to look at me, his eyes wide and lost, like a child who doesn't understand the rules of a game he's just lost. "So what happens now?" he asked, his voice cracking. I stood up and walked to the railing, looking out at the dark harbor, at the lights of Fort Sumter blinking in the distance. I felt a profound sense of peace settle over me, a quiet stillness in the center of my soul. The anger was gone. The resentment was gone. All that was left was a deep, sad clarity. "I forgive you," I said, and as the words left my lips, I realized I meant them. It wasn't a gift I was giving him. It was a gift I was giving myself. Not because you deserve it, but because I deserve peace. I turned back to him. "But I can't forget. Our relationship, whatever it was, it ended last night. You'll always be my father. That's a fact of biology. But I can no longer be the audience for your story." I turned and walked away, leaving him alone on the bench with the truth of who he was. I didn't look back. The immense weight I had carried on my shoulders for 45 years, the desperate need for a father's approval that had driven and haunted me my entire life, finally, mercifully, lifted. I was free. Healing is not a destination, it's a journey. It doesn't arrive like a thunderclap, but like a quiet sunrise you only notice has happened when you feel the warmth on your skin. My sunrise began a few months after the gala, on a humid Memorial Day in Charleston. I was standing in the crowd at the annual parade, watching the high school marching bands and local veterans groups pass by. An unexpected speaker was added to the ceremony at the last minute. It was my father. He walked to the podium not in a suit, but in his old, faded Army uniform, the one that fit him a little too tightly now, the fabric frayed at the collar. There were no news cameras, no prepared script. He looked out at the familiar faces of his community, his neighbors, and his peers. "I was wrong," he said, his voice quiet but clear, carrying across the silent park. "I confused attention with honor. I confused bitterness with duty. And I hurt the daughter I was supposed to protect." He never looked at me, just kept his gaze fixed on the horizon. The crowd didn't applaud or condemn. They just listened, a quiet, reluctant acceptance of a late but courageous first step. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't a reconciliation. But it was a start. His start. After the ceremony, I drove alone out to the old fishing pier on Lake Moultrie, the same one he had talked about on television. The wooden planks were weathered and gray, warped by years of sun and rain. In my wallet, I carried a photograph, its corners soft and creased from years of being handled. It was a picture of me at 10 years old, standing on this very pier, beaming with a gap-toothed smile, holding up the first fish I ever caught. My father stood beside me, his arm around my shoulder, a rare, genuine smile on his face. For so long, that photo had been both a comfort and a curse. It was a reminder of a happiness that felt real, and a painful symbol of everything I thought I had lost. It represented the father I'd always craved and the daughter I'd always tried to be. I took it out of my wallet and looked at it one last time. I saw not a lost dream, but a memory. Just a moment in time, nothing more, nothing less. I held it up and let the breeze take it. The small rectangle of paper fluttered for a moment, catching the light before gently landing on the surface of the water. It floated there for a moment, then began its slow journey out into the lake, carried by the current. I wasn't erasing the past. I was just letting go of the need to live in it. A year later, I found myself standing on another stage. This one was far more intimidating than any ballroom. I was at the United States Military Academy at West Point, delivering the keynote address for graduation week. My career had been fully reinstated. The executives from Atlantic Forge were facing a slew of federal charges. The truth had won. I stood at the podium in Mickey Stadium, looking out at the long gray line, thousands of cadets, their faces young, disciplined, and full of the fierce, unshakable belief that they could change the world. I saw myself in their eyes, the same burning ambition, the same unwavering commitment to the ideals of duty, honor, country. I had been invited to speak on the topic of honor in the age of disinformation. I didn't tell them the details of my story. They didn't need to know the specifics of my war. They needed to know the lessons learned from the battlefield. "Your greatest duty," I began, my voice clear and strong, echoing across the hallowed grounds, "is not just to your country or to the army. Your greatest duty is to the truth." I paused, letting the words sink in. There will be times in your career when you will face unimaginable choices. Times when your loyalty will be tested, not by a foreign enemy, but by the very people standing next to you. In those moments, remember that your moral compass is your most powerful weapon. It is the one piece of equipment that can never be issued to you. It must be forged within you. I looked out at the sea of determined faces. Honor is not something bestowed upon you on a stage with a medal. It isn't found in the applause of a crowd or the headlines in a newspaper. Real honor is what you build, in silence, every single day, with the choices you make when no one is watching. It's the truth you tell when a lie is easier. It's the integrity you maintain when you think you can get away with it. I thought of Eleanor Roosevelt's famous words, a quote that had become my own quiet mantra. "No one can make you feel inferior without your consent." I had finally stopped giving my consent. You will all go on to be leaders, I concluded. Lead with courage, but more importantly, lead with truth. Because in the end, that is the only legacy that will ever truly matter. When I finished, a profound silence held the stadium for a beat, and then, the entire corps of cadets rose to their feet as one, their applause thundering against the granite walls. It was a sound of respect, of understanding. And in that moment, I knew I had finally found my true legacy. It wasn't my rank. It wasn't a medal pinned to my chest. It was this moment, this lesson, passed from one soldier to the next. A small piece of hard-won truth given to a new generation, ready to build an honorable future of their own. Thank you for walking this road with me. My story is proof that your value is not determined by the family you were born into, but by the integrity you build within yourself. The battles we fight behind closed doors are often the hardest, but they are the ones that forge who we are truly meant to be. If this story resonated with you, please consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear that they are not alone. And for more stories about resilience and finding your own truth, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Thank you for listening.